Welcome everyone to today's devotion. Lord willing, you were able to join us yesterday for our worship where we just sang, and I thought the worship team did a fantastic job. But we are in Matthew chapter 26, which means come Monday, Lord willing, if we all make it there, we will be done with the Gospel of Matthew. Now, originally our goal was by the time we finish Matthew, the economy will be opening up, and to a certain extent that is the case, but not quite where I think we had hoped it would be. But nevertheless, we want to march forward. I want to go about this chapter a little different. For one, because it's a massively important chapter, of course. We've reached the climax, chapters 26, 27, of the Gospel of Matthew, right? So 26, 27, 28 is the betrayal, the trial, the crucifixion, burial, resurrection of Jesus. Right? A lot of things happen. Such a small amount of space in terms of chapters. And as such, each of these chapters are so full. There's no way we can go through them in any detail. And I want to try to keep it each day between about 15-20 minutes. So what we have here is the events leading up to Jesus's betrayal. Okay, at least starting here in chapter 26. And one of the things that Matthew does really well is he likes juxtaposition, where he presents you to characters, to events, whatnot, and he wants you to compare and contrast. We've already seen that, right, with, say, the feeding of the 4 and the feeding of the 5,000, and we are purposely to see what's different about them. We can see the similarity, right? It's the same pattern, the same story arc, but what's different? And I've argued that the difference is location. The grace that Christ shows to the Jews in feeding the 5,000 and with 12 loaves left is the grace he shows to the Gentiles with 4,000 with 7 baskets left. He does the same thing in chapters 26 and 27. So notice, first of all, this juxtaposition between two private meetings. Okay, the first meeting is there, and the context of the meeting is, how can they destroy Jesus? So you get there, verse 3. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. Now, a couple of things to note here. First of all, what we have here isn't new information per se, right? We've known for quite a while they've been wanting to get rid of Jesus. That's not new. What we are shown is that this plan is going to be put into action now, right? Before it was, we need to come up with a plan, right? We've got to deal with this guy. Now it is, this needs to be done within the next week. Right? So the events of the conspiracy is speeding up quite a bit. And notice there they say that they want to do this, but not during the feast, because he's popular among the people. And there we're reminded that it is God who controls history, not governments, not people, and not circumstances, not plagues, right? God is the one who controls history. They wanted to do it on their timeline. God secured that it would be done on his. So you have that meeting, right? It is a meeting regarding the destruction of Jesus. But then notice that we have another meeting. In fact, let's skip it. Let's go down to verse 14. What you're going to see is another meeting, and this is Judas agreeing to betray Jesus. So notice what you can do. You can read verses 3 to 5, and then you can read 14 to 16, and the story works really well, right? So verse 5, and they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. Down to verse 14, then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what will you give me if I deliver him over to you? You see how that story works really well. However, what Matthew does is he sandwiches the story about the woman at Bethany between these two meetings. And what is it that we have here? We have an unnamed woman. Now, John tells us who she is, right? Her name's Mary. But in Matthew and Mark's gospel, she is unnamed. They are in the context of Simon the leper, which circumstantial evidence shows Jesus had healed Simon the leper. And now Simon is inviting people in his home, like Matthew, the tax collector earlier. He's welcoming Jesus and others into his home. And they're in the midst of that shared meal, that shared experience of fellowship. This woman takes an expensive ointment, which was often used for insurance, for dowry, for anointing a body, for burial, those sort of things. Very expensive perfume, and she anoints Jesus' body. This is clearly an act of worship. This is an act of a woman who recognizes who Jesus is, and in contrast to that, who she is. Right, and so yes, the disciples complain, why this waste? And Jesus explains, in pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. And yet we don't have her name, do we? And that's the beauty of the kingdom of God. You don't have to have a big following on Twitter in order for God to use you. No, God blesses those whose heart are in the right place, who live with a repentant heart and worship Him in spirit and in truth. God is pleased with them. And so what we have in the midst of all of this conspiracy and this evil and this awfulness is we have this precious picture of a woman who's anointing Jesus, preparing Him for burial. It really is how do you perceive Jesus is all there, isn't it? Some, to this day, try to put Jesus back into the tomb, whether by law, by mockery, by criticism, by rejection, by sin, by rebellion, by whatever. But may we be like this woman, found at the feet of Jesus, because we don't want our name publicized. We want His name publicized. Well, then we move to the Passover, right? Started in verse 17. And again, we're to look at another juxtaposition, right? And what we have here is the tale of two disciples. Now, in the middle of this is the Lord's Supper, okay? So it opens up with Jesus making preparations, yes, but then the big issue is verse 21, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him after another, is it I, Lord, right? So Jesus just drops the bomb, right? And he says, one of you guys is going to hand me over to be crucified. Right, now that is a way to ruin dinner, isn't it? You know, you ever have family reunion like this? And so they're looking inward, yes, but then you can imagine these teenagers are going to start looking outward. If it's not me, it must be them. It must be him, right? And so you have there the issue of the disciples is one of them is going to betray Jesus. But then if you skip down, right, to verse 30, Jesus foretells the denial of Jesus. So starting in verse 31, Jesus said to them, you will all fall away because of me this night. So notice it isn't just about Peter, it's about all of them. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. And it is in that context, Peter says, well, look, I've already decided. It ain't going to be me who's going to betray you. And I can tell you, I'm not going to deny you. So whoever it is you're talking to, you ain't talking to me, right? And it is then Jesus says, you will betray me 3 times before the rooster crows. Before the sun rises, you will deny me 3 times. So notice, we have here, you have these 2 scenes of betrayal and denial, right? And in the middle of that is the Lord's Supper. It's the same pattern we saw with the woman in Bethany, didn't we? We have a sandwich between this beautiful scene of worship and of grace, the ugliness of this world. So too we see it again, that sandwich between the beauty of the Lord's Supper and all the meaning within it. You have the ugliness of man and their sin. So there's something I think Matthew is trying to show us here is that in the midst of all this chaos, there is the glory of God still working. We really need to hear that in this time of lockdown, don't we? I'm getting as stir crazy as you are. But let this be a time of glorifying God and thankfulness to God and joy in God amid such chaos. And so we get the Lord's Supper in verses 26 to 29. Jesus says, "Take, eat, this is my body." He took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for you for the forgiveness of sins." That's the point of the cross. Jesus is being handed over for the sake of man's sins. And which again, the juxtaposition is so important. Because at each juxtaposition, what is the issue? Man's sinfulness. And why is Jesus going to the cross? To deal with that core issue. Jesus is going to seek the forgiveness of man's sins and thus set them free from it. So the world we see here doesn't need to be the world that we live in now. Well, then everything moves to Gethsemane. And here Jesus prays, starting in verse 36. And he says, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And there's two ways we can look at this passage. And really what follows it is we can see Jesus as weak and almost, for lack of a better term, cowardly, right? He wants to get out of what is coming to him. Now, to say that Jesus is weak is, in this context, to acknowledge that Jesus is human. It's one of the problems with this scene is we struggle seeing Jesus as human. In the early church, the temptation was to embrace the deity of Christ and reject his humanity. Now it's the opposite. We want to liberals embrace the humanity and reject the deity. So what conservatives have done is we've so emphasized the deity is at the cost of the humanity of Jesus. Yet Jesus is like us in every way, yet without sin. And so we see that here. Here we see man of sorrows, what a name. Right? And he is pouring his heart out, right? And it says in verse 37 that he was sorrowful and troubled, right? Because he understands that the burden he's about to carry is bigger than physical pain. Yes, the cross is going to hurt. Yes, those whippings are going to be excruciating. But the great burden he carries is the sins of man and the wrath of God. Jesus is standing as our substitute. So he says there in verse 39, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And see, that's the key, is we can look at this scene and say, look, Jesus is scared to death. Or we can say, through prayer, through encountering the Father, what we see is a Jesus who is courageous. Though knowing what awaits him and the burden he will be carrying, a burden that none of us will ever have to carry, yet he continues on. Yet he rises to the occasion. You can't separate the courage of Jesus from the prayer life of Jesus. So it isn't what I want to do, he says. It is what you want me to do. Boy, America would... We would do well, particularly the American church, if we learned to pray like that. He came to the disciples and found them sleeping. He said to Peter, "So could you not watch with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, the flesh is weak." There's another warning. But notice he's saying that in your self-confidence, you lack the key to courage, and that is prayer. So he goes back and prays, says the same thing, "Your will be done." And then once everyone shows up, what is it that Jesus says in verse 46? "Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." That is a man of great courage. And of course, what happens? They come to betray Jesus. Judas kisses Jesus there, 48 and 49. And then Jesus responds to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Again, the emphasis is going to be on the courage of Jesus. We have the man who prayed in the garden. He's now ready to face whatever comes his way. And what does Peter do? Because he's a man, is he takes out his dagger, which would have been common for them to carry around. No doubt the libs would fight to get rid of all the similar daggers after this event. And he's just swinging, right? He's just swinging. Wherever it lands, it lands. I don't think Peter's aiming for this dude's ear. Either, and so we need to see it one or two ways. Either Peter has the best aim in the world, he was aiming for an ear, or he has the absolute worst aim in the world, and he was aiming for something more permanent. But nevertheless, Jesus says to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send more than 12 legions of angels? Those who live by violence will die by violence. One of my favorite little historical books was on the Hatfields McCoys, and my summary of that book was simply, those who live by the Winchester die by the Winchester. There is something, and our culture has to learn to it. Those who live by identity politics will die by identity politics. Those who are driven, who live by partisan politics will die by partisan politics. And you'll lose your soul as a result. Those who live by racism will die by it. Those who live by violence will die by violence. But if you live by Christ, you can truly live. So Jesus says, look, I'm the one actually in control here. You not realize that my Father can save me. God doesn't need you, Peter. Right? Now I know that sounds offensive to our culture where everyone's offended because of the fear of being offended. But Jesus just said to Peter, I do not need your help. I'm a little more powerful than you. But Jesus willingly goes in obedience to God. Look, God doesn't need your help. What he needs is your faithfulness. What he requires is your obedience. Well, this leads to the first part of Jesus' trial. There's two trials. There's an ecclesial trial and a civil trial. Here we see the ecclesiastical trial. And again, we're seeing some juxtaposition. First the council, and then Peter. And what we are to see is that following his arrest, Jesus is alone. He alone carries the burden that is the sinfulness of man upon his shoulders. And so in the trial, they're going to find him guilty of blasphemy, but they do so on account of false witnesses. So you see them there in verse 60. False witnesses came forward, and at last two came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. That, of course, is in context of the destruction or cleansing of the temple. And John tells us that Jesus is referring to his body. This temple will be destroyed, but in 3 days I'll raise it up again. They took that to mean as a personal assault on the temple. That is very, very serious crime. And the high priest says, have you no answer to make? And Jesus remains silent. He didn't remain silent permanently, but to these false witnesses, Jesus didn't give them the time of day. I think there's some wisdom in that. Right? And then the question from the high priest is, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus says, you have said so. In other words, yes. Again, Jesus affirms his deity throughout the four Gospels. But I tell you, from now on, in case you don't believe that he affirmed his divine being, you will see the Son of Man, that's language from Daniel, seated at the right hand of power and coming on clouds of heaven. That is messianic divine language taken from Daniel. The high priest tore his robes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. So if Jesus never claimed to be divine, then someone needs to explain to me, why did the high priest react the way he did? The reason is because what Jesus said, if not true, is blasphemy. But Matthew has developed a story so that we, the reader, can see Jesus really is who he says he is. And in that context, they agree to have Jesus crucified. Now, this is going to be important because we're going to see a change in the narrative tomorrow. They are wanting to kill Jesus because of blasphemy. When they hand him over to civil authorities, they accuse him of something very different. Insurrection. Right? Because their motive is not justice. It is injustice. And then what do we see right after that? Not even Jesus' closest disciple is with him. In fact, while Jesus is being falsely accused in this monkey court, what is happening outside the court? Peter denies ever knowing who Jesus was. And when the rooster crows, this is going to come into play with what we see tomorrow, the very last part of chapter 26. He went out and wept bitterly. Well, we're going to see where this goes tomorrow. Of course, the crucifixion of Jesus. And Lord willing, we'll see you guys tomorrow as we look at that, the great climax of our faith. See ya.